In 1991, Japan was on top of the world economically. At the peak of its bubble, there was even a famous saying, "The land under Tokyo alone was worth more than the entire United States." Japan dominated the list of the world's most valuable companies. Everyone believed Japan was going to shape the next century. Then, almost overnight, it all stopped. The real estate bubble popped. Banks got stuck under a mountain of bad loans. What came next wasn't a sudden dramatic collapse. It was something even worse, a long, slow, painful stagnation. This era later became known as Japan's lost decades. How does a country with world-class manufacturing, a hard-working, disciplined workforce, huge savings rates, and global giants like Sony and Toyota fall from the very top into 30 years of stagnation? The system didn't crash in a single day. It just slowed down. Then it stopped. And maybe the most uncomfortable question of all is this: was Japan really a failure during those decades? Or have we just misunderstood what actually happened? This video isn't about drowning you in numbers and statistics. We're going to take a calm, clear look at how things actually work. What happens when a whole society loses its confidence? How does a country change when growth just vanishes? When the future feels fuzzy and uncertain, what do people and nations choose to hold on to? This isn't just a story about Japan's past. It's about the structural cycles that drive modern economic cycle that still matter deeply today, and that could quietly shape where we're all headed next. In the 1980s, the whole world looked up to Japan. Japan will dominate the 21st century wasn't some catchy slogan. It was a consensus everyone around the globe bought into. Back home in Japan, people weren't just optimistic. They were practically ecstatic. New graduates could walk straight into top companies. No struggle needed. The lifetime employment system meant you had rock-solid security, like a safety net you never had to worry about. And real estate, stock prices, they went up every single day, it seemed like. For regular families, the plan was simple enough: borrow some money, buy a house, buy some stocks, and just sit back and watch your wealth grow, almost without lifting a finger. But here's the thing: when an entire society starts thinking, the future's only going to get better, and there's no more risk, danger's usually already creeping in. This kind of collective hype isn't just something that happened to Japan. It's pretty much the same mindset you see in a lot of countries when they're in the late stages of a fast growth cycle. You gotta get this straight. A bubble isn't just when asset prices go up. It's when everyone's 100% sure they'll keep going up. That collective certainty is what makes a bubble. When everyone's on the same page, nobody even thinks about risk anymore. Hardly anyone pauses to ask the tough questions. Can housing prices really keep climbing forever? Is this stock market boom actually backed by real productivity? And how much weakness is hiding under all that borrowed money? The turning point started back in 1985 with the Plaza Accord. After that agreement, the yen shot up in value, really sharply. To counteract the hit to exports, Japan's central bank slashed interest rates aggressively. What happened next? Tons of cheap money flooded into the financial system. But here's the catch. Most of that cash didn't go into the real economy, the parts that actually make things or create real value. Instead, it all piled into real estate and stocks. Then a cycle started, one that fed on itself. Easy credit pushed asset prices up. Higher asset prices made people's collateral worth more. Better collateral let people borrow even more. And that extra borrowing pushed prices up even further. It was a loop that just kept going. Back then, making money was basically effortless, like you didn't even have to try that hard. The value of a house going up in just 1 year could be more than what someone made working for several years. Even if you bought a random stock on a whim, it could get you close to what we now call financial independence. When things are that easy, working hard for the long haul, being disciplined about it, that starts to look silly, right? Like, why bother? And little by little, people stopped thinking about risk altogether. It just faded away without anyone really noticing. But here's the thing. Any prosperity that's built on rising asset prices, not actual productivity, has to come back down to reality eventually. A bubble's just like a balloon. If you blow it up way beyond what it can handle, the outside might look smooth and impressive. But all it takes is one tiny pinprick to pop it. Japan's misfortune wasn't just that a bubble formed. It was that by the time it hit its peak, almost nobody was willing to admit or even believe that it could burst. And when the market finally started to correct itself, it wasn't just a little economic tweak. It completely reshaped how people felt, how institutions worked, and even the path that an entire generation would take. Back in 1990, the Nikkei index hit its all-time high to 38,915 points. But right after that, it crashed hard, and that was the start of Japan's lost 3 decades. At its lowest point, the index dropped all the way to 7,603. That's an over 80% decline. For a lot of families, their entire life savings were basically gone. Poof, just like that. Then came a real estate crash just as bad. Tokyo's property prices fell about 60% in just a few years. Tons of homeowners ended up in negative equity, meaning they owed the bank more money than their house was even worth. For so many people, decades of working hard, being disciplined, it didn't get them wealth. Instead, it messed up their finances for the long haul, leaving them with balance sheet damage that took years to even start digging out of. More businesses went bankrupt. Unemployment started going up. Even Japan's famous lifetime employment system, the one everyone used to praise, started to fall apart, little by little. At the same time, banks were stuck holding tons of bad loans, the kind people couldn't pay back. But instead of facing those losses head-on and dealing with them quickly, most banks dragged their feet, hiding how bad things really were. They didn't want to lend money anymore, but they also refused to shut down or liquidate the bad debt. What came out of that? These so-called zombie banks, places that were technically still in business, but basically frozen. They weren't doing anything useful. They were just stuck, barely hanging on. That makes you wonder a really important question. Why didn't Japan just deal with those bad debts quickly, like the US usually does when there's a financial crisis? Why not force companies to restructure, clean up the whole system, and get growth going again? The answer isn't that their policies were just bad or incompetent. It's something that almost nobody paid attention to back then. It's called a balance sheet recession. In a normal recession, you lower interest rates, and that gets people borrowing and investing again. Simple enough. But in a balance sheet recession, it's different. The private sector ends up owing more money than their assets are worth. When that happens, their main goal changes. They don't care about expanding or making as much profit as possible anymore. All they want to do is pay down their debt. And here's the thing, no matter how hard policymakers try, cutting rates, pumping money into the economy, making sure there's plenty of cash available, it doesn't help much. If households are saving every penny instead of spending it, and businesses are using their money to pay off debt instead of investing in growth, that cash just sits there. It doesn't circulate through the economy like it's supposed to. It just piles up in savings accounts, doing nothing. Even profitable companies don't want to expand their capacity. They hold back, hesitant to take any chances. And households, even those with steady incomes, start cutting back on non-essential spending. They don't splurge on extras anymore. Banks, even with regulators breathing down their necks, still live in fear of making new loans that might turn bad. This isn't just a regular economic slump. It's a total collapse of confidence, the kind that seeps into every part of society. Macroeconomic numbers? They can stabilize pretty fast, all things considered. But once that collective faith in the future gets broken, rebuilding it can take a whole generation, or even longer. When a society stops assuming tomorrow will be better than today, when people stop taking risks, and stability becomes the only thing that matters, that economic energy just freezes up. It locks itself in, and suddenly nothing feels like it can move forward anymore. And in this long, dragged-out stagnation, the ones hit the hardest are usually the young people, the ones who are just starting their adult lives right when opportunities dry up. Japan didn't just lose a few years of economic growth. It came close to losing something way more invisible, but way more important, the confidence, the drive, and the hope of an entire generation. After the bubble popped, Japan got what everyone came to call the lost generation, those who started working in the early 1990s. They'd grown up hearing the same thing over and over. Work hard, and you'll succeed. Japan's only going to get stronger and stronger. But by the time they became adults, things were nothing like that. Jobs were hard to come by. Asset prices had crashed and burned, and that lifetime employment system they'd been counting on, it was starting to fall apart at the seams. Back in the Heisei era, there was a term that got really popular, Heisei losers. People used it to talk about young folks who seemed unmotivated, kept to themselves, and spent too much time in virtual worlds, like games or the internet. But here's the thing we should really be asking. Did society even have the right to make fun of them? When working hard doesn't guarantee you anything anymore, when the future feels shaky no matter what you do, pulling back from risks isn't being lazy. It's just a way to protect yourself. During this time, Japan's subcultures blew up. Anime, gaming, manga, virtual idols, all of these got huge. More and more young people started staying indoors, skipping the usual social paths, and drowning themselves in digital worlds instead. Why? Because the virtual world gave them something the real economy couldn't: a feeling of accomplishment, a sense of fitting in, and a system they could control. You got predictable results. Compare that to the real world. It was all uncertainty, fewer and fewer opportunities, and no clear payoff for working hard. It's no wonder so many choose to check out. When economic growth slows down and the future feels unclear, something subtle but powerful happens to people's minds. Risk tolerance just shrinks. This isn't just a personal choice. It becomes a shared mindset across the whole society. When you see people around you struggling, when failure stops being abstract and becomes real, when the system rewards stability far more than ambition, even people who are naturally bold end up playing it safe. And this mental pullback can be way more harmful than the recession itself. Technically, an economy can start up again. Central banks can tweak monetary policy. Governments can spend more money to boost things. But once a generation loses its hunger for risk, rebuilding that confidence is insanely hard. It's like a seed that's been crushed under heavy pressure. Even if the sun comes out and the rain falls again, there's no guarantee it'll ever grow. It might just stay crushed, never sprouting like it should. But it's not right to say Japan just fell apart and went into decline. Even during all that long, slow stagnation, some companies still stayed disciplined and kept adapting. Few restructured quickly and decisively when they needed to. Others shifted their strategies and found new chances to succeed globally. Just because the whole economy was stuck doesn't mean every single company or person was stuck too. When people hear the lost decades, most just assume Japanese companies stopped being competitive. But that's way too oversimplified. Even through all that long stagnation, plenty of companies didn't just survive. They found their own way to grow, separate from the struggling economy. Two of the most representative examples are Toyota Motor Corporation and SoftBank Group. Before the bubble popped, Toyota was already a well-respected car maker. But here's the thing. Most of its money still came from Japan and the US. Its revenue was really tied to those two markets. When the bubble crashed and people at home stopped buying cars, a lot of Toyota's competitors reacted the same way, cutting production, laying off workers, or just hunkering down with defensive restructuring to survive. But Toyota did something different. They made two crucial calls that changed everything. First, it accelerated international expansion. Instead of staying dependent on a stagnant home market, Toyota pushed aggressively into emerging economies, especially China and Southeast Asia. Back then, many Japanese companies were afraid to expand overseas. With so much uncertainty at home, taking risks abroad felt even scarier. But Toyota saw something clear. Japan's market was maturing. For long-term survival, it had to spread out across the world. Second, it doubled down on operational discipline. When the economy's stuck, people change how they buy things. They get more rational. Prestige doesn't matter as much anymore. What counts is reliability and getting your money's worth. Toyota stuck to what it did best. It polished its lean production systems, tightened up cost controls, and made sure every car was consistently high quality. By making cars that were durable and affordable, it didn't just get stronger in emerging markets. It held its ground, even in the US. And over time, Toyota passed those traditional American auto giants to become the world's biggest car maker, measured by how many vehicles it sold. The second example is SoftBank. Before the crash, SoftBank was just a small software distributor, nothing too big or notable. But after the bubble popped, Japan's tech sector sank into a long slump. Capital dried up, investors pulled back, and things looked grim all around. But its founder, Masayoshi Son, saw something no one else did. Technological change wasn't going to stop just because Japan's economy was struggling. The world was still moving forward, and tech would keep transforming everything. Even in a recession, he made a bold, counter-cyclical move, investing heavily in new internet companies, right when everyone else was feeling super pessimistic. The most famous example? Back in 1999, SoftBank put $20 million into a tiny Chinese startup that almost no one had heard of at the time, Alibaba Group. That one investment ended up making hundreds of billions of dollars in returns, and it turned SoftBank from a small player into one of the most powerful investment groups in the world. The bigger lesson is clear. Macroeconomic stagnation does not wipe out structural opportunities. Even in the coldest phase of an economic cycle, transformation keeps going somewhere. Technology advances, demographics shift, new markets open up. The decisive factor is not just the external environment, but how decision-makers choose to respond to it. Many people and companies get trapped in cycles not just because times are hard, but because they let hard times take away their ability to choose. Toyota didn't decline with Japan's domestic market because it chose to expand globally. SoftBank didn't retreat during the tech slump because it chose to bet on long-term structural change. Economic cycles limit what you can do, but they never take away your choice, and that difference is everything. For a long time, the usual story about Japan's lost decades has been pretty straightforward. Japan declined, falling from a powerful economic force into a state of stagnation. But if we look past GDP growth as the only way to measure success, and take a fresh look at those years, a different picture starts to come into view. Maybe right from the beginning, we've been misreading this so-called stagnation period all along. Japan's per capita GDP stayed among the highest in the world the whole time, even after its total GDP was eventually overtaken by other economies. Japan's per capita income never dropped below $30,000. That's the kind of number you see in a highly developed country. Slower economic growth didn't mean people's living standards fell apart. Life stayed stable, comfortable, even as the economy slowed down. Japanese companies stayed globally competitive too. Sure, some old-school traditional firms struggled, but Japan held on to world-leading spots in high-end manufacturing, semiconductor equipment, pharmaceuticals, anime, and gaming. Think about semiconductor equipment. Japanese companies grabbed a dominant share of the global market. Anime and games? They turned into major cultural exports, loved all over the world. And big names like Toyota, Honda, and Sony. They kept right on being some of the top corporations on the planet. Japanese society also kept its amazing stability and high quality of life. Public safety, social order, environmental management, education, and healthcare. All of these stayed world-class. Low crime rates and strong public services meant that even as GDP growth slowed down, people's daily lives and overall well-being barely felt it. Life stayed steady, safe, and comfortable for most citizens. If a country keeps a high per capita income, strong social safety nets, competitive companies, and a stable society, then calling it a failure just because its growth slowed down, that's way too simplistic. Growth isn't the only measure of success. What matters more is whether people are living well, whether the society is stable, and whether companies can still compete globally. Japan had all of that, even with slower growth. At its core, Japan's last 3 decades weren't a failure. They were a tough transition, moving from an era of lightning-fast growth to a mature, stable society. When economies are booming, it's all about speed and scale. But when growth slows down, quality, stability, and people's well-being take center stage. The reason we see it as a failure is because we're only looking at one thing, GDP growth. We're ignoring all the other parts of development that matter just as much, if not more. The greatest lesson from this history is not how to avoid stagnation, but how to properly understand it. How can a society or an individual find the right rhythm in slower cycles? How can we shift from chasing speed to pursuing excellence? Japan's experience shows that mastering the art of transition is far more important than merely chasing growth. Looking back at Japan's whole journey, at the height of the bubble, the whole country was caught up in a collective illusion. Everyone was swept up in the hype. Then, when the bubble burst, confidence crashed, setting off a balance sheet recession and decades of stagnation. But even in that stagnation, some companies bounced back stronger, and ordinary people kept going, never giving up. In the end, Japan moved from a high-growth model to a mature, stable one, and in doing so, it achieved a different kind of success. One that's not measured just by speed, but by stability, quality, and people's well-being. This history reveals 3 fundamental truths. First, growth is never eternal, and bubbles don't last forever. No matter how strong a country, a company, or even an individual may be, collective excitement can cloud our judgment and create illusions of endless success. Rationality are the only real safeguards against falling into that trap. Second, confidence collapse is more dangerous than economic decline, but rebuilding it depends on oneself. Policy can support the economy, but it cannot inject courage. True recovery begins when individuals choose to act and persist despite uncertainty. Third, macroeconomic cycles are beyond our control, but our individual stance is not. Even in the harshest environments, structural opportunities still exist. What truly causes defeat is rarely time itself. It is the voluntary surrender of agency. When others wait for certainty, are you quietly preparing your future? When growth slows, do you choose passivity, or do you invest in yourself and seize opportunities? This is the deepest lesson Japan's last decades leave for each of us.